Hello there and welcome to Scientific Serenity. Everything you hear here is carefully researched and prepared for you. Now, take a deep breath. Let the darkness become gentle. Before we begin, you may notice your body starting to relax. A gentle yawn may arrive. Your breathing may slow. As this story unfolds, your mind will drift naturally towards sleep. By the middle of this journey, rest will come quietly, and when you wake, you may feel calmer, because tonight, you fell asleep through science and learned something most people never will. If you see me as someone from your own family who researches and prepares this knowledge for you, subscribing, liking, and leaving a comment would truly mean a lot to me. And let the story begin. There is a blank space on the map. In western China, north of Tibet, south of Mongolia, there lies a place whose very name inspires fear: Taklamakan. In the Uyghur language, it means you can enter, but you will never leave. And this is no exaggeration. For thousands of years, caravans have disappeared into this desert, cities have been buried beneath the sand, and human beings have been buried so deep that even their skeletons would never be found. The Taklamakan is one of the driest places on Earth. Annual rainfall measures less than 10 millimeters, meaning that in some years, not a single drop of water falls from its sky. The temperatures swing between extremes that would kill an unprotected human within hours. Scorching heat that can reach 40 degrees Celsius during the day, and freezing cold that plunges below zero at night. It is a landscape designed by geology to be inhospitable, a fortress of sand and silence that has kept its secrets for millennia. But the desert does not only kill, it also preserves. In the early 20th century, as the great powers of Europe were carving up the world and the Silk Road had long faded into memory, a handful of explorers began to venture into the Taklamakan's empty spaces. They were not looking for treasure exactly, though treasure would find them. They were looking for something more valuable, the ghosts of civilizations that had vanished into the sand. Among these explorers was a Swede named Sven Hedin, a man whose name would become synonymous with Central Asian discovery. In 1934, guided by local Uyghur hunters who spoke of strange things buried in the desert, Hedin's expedition stumbled upon something that would challenge everything we thought we knew about the peopling of Asia. They called it Xiaohe, the Little River Cemetery. Imagine for a moment that you are standing at the edge of this discovery. The year is 1934. You are in the middle of the Taklamakan Desert, hundreds of kilometers from the nearest settlement. The landscape around you is not the rolling dunes of popular imagination, but something stranger, a vast, flat plain of cracked clay, punctuated by the skeletons of long-dead poplar trees, their branches reaching toward the empty sky like the fingers of drowning men. Your guides, Uyghur hunters who have lived on the edges of this desert for generations, speak of a place where the sand hides secrets. They call it the Cemetery of 1,000 Coffins. They say that their grandfathers' grandfathers told stories of a time when a great river flowed here, and a great people lived along its banks. Then the river dried up, and the people vanished, and the desert took everything. You follow them across the cracked earth, past the dead trees, toward a dune that looks like all the other dunes. But as you approach, you begin to see something strange protruding from the sand. They are poles. Hundreds of poles, their tips weathered by centuries of wind, arranged in concentric circles like the spokes of enormous wheels. Some are painted with faded stripes of red and black. Others are carved into rough shapes, human faces, perhaps, or abstract symbols whose meaning has been lost to time. And beneath these poles, buried in the sand, are the boats. Not real boats, of course. The nearest water is hundreds of kilometers away. But the coffins of Xiaohe are shaped like boats, their wooden planks curved upward at both ends, as if the dead were meant to sail across an ocean of sand into the afterlife. They are stacked in layers, one atop another, a silent fleet of the departed. You open one. This is the moment that defines the mystery of the Tarim mummies. This is the image that would haunt archaeologists for nearly a century. This is the visual shock that still defies explanation. Inside the boat coffin, wrapped in a shroud of coarse wool, lies a body. Not a skeleton, a body. The desert has done its work perfectly, mummifying the flesh so completely that the face is still recognizable after nearly 4,000 years. The skin is dark, not the brown of sun-dried leather, but something else entirely. It is black. A deep, uniform, almost polished black, like obsidian or jet. But it is not the color of the skin that stops your heart. It is the hair. The hair cascades from the scalp in waves, preserved in astonishing detail by the dry desert air. It is long, it is thick, and it is blonde. Not the dark hair of East Asia where you are standing. Not the black hair of the indigenous peoples of Central Asia. This is European blonde, the color of Scandinavian wheat fields, of Baltic summer, of everything that this desert is not. The face beneath that blonde hair is long, with high cheekbones and a prominent nose. The eyes, sealed by death, would have been large, perhaps blue or green. The body, when fully excavated, would be measured at nearly 2 meters in length. A giant by the standards of the Bronze Age, taller than most modern Europeans, towering over the smaller statured peoples of ancient China. This person does not belong here. This person, with their blonde hair and their black skin and their boat-shaped coffin in the middle of the driest desert on earth, is an anomaly, a contradiction. A mystery written in flesh and bone and preserved across 4,000 years. Who were they? Where did they come from? Why did they paint their dead black? Or why did the desert turn them that color on its own? And what were Europeans doing in China 2,000 years before Marco Polo was even born? These are the questions that the Tarim mummies ask. These are the questions that, nearly a century after their discovery, we are still struggling to answer. The Xiaohe Cemetery, as it would come to be known, contains more than 300 such burials. They span a period of roughly 1,500 years, from approximately 2000 BCE to 500 BCE. A time when the Great Pyramids of Egypt were already ancient history, when the Indus Valley civilization was collapsing, when the ancestors of Homer were composing the epics that would become the Iliad and the Odyssey. Throughout this immense span of time, A single people occupied this remote desert oasis, burying their dead in boat-shaped coffins, marking their graves with forests of carved poles, and preserving their bodies through a combination of natural conditions and perhaps deliberate ritual. The men were tall, often exceeding 180 centimeters. The women were shorter but still robust. Their clothing, remarkably preserved, included woolen fabrics woven in patterns that would later become famous thousands of kilometers to the west. Tartans, checks, and stripes that look for all the world like the traditional kilts of the Scottish Highlands. Their hats were felt, their boots were leather, and their tools were bronze and stone and bone, crafted with a skill that speaks of deep tradition and settled life. And their faces, when the sand gave them back to us, were covered in a substance that turned their skin black. This is the anomaly in the desert. This is the mystery that has haunted archaeology for nearly a century. This is the story of the black mummies of Tarim, a people who did not belong where they were found, who preserved their dead in ways that still defy explanation, and who vanished so completely that they left no trace except their black-faced bodies in the sand. Let us now step back from the edge of discovery and ask the question that every archaeologist asks when confronted with something that does not fit. How did they get here? The Tarim Basin, where the Xiaohe Cemetery lies, is a geographical oddity. Surrounded on all sides by some of the highest mountain ranges on Earth, the Himalayas to the south, the Pamirs to the west, the Tian Shan to the north, it is a vast depression, a bowl scooped out of the roof of the world. Rivers fed by glacial meltwater flow down from the mountains into this basin, but they go nowhere. They evaporate in the desert sun or sink into the sand, their waters lost to the sky and the earth. For most of human history, the Tarim Basin was uninhabitable. The few oases that dotted its margins supported small populations of hunter-gatherers, but the interior remained empty, a wasteland of sand and salt and silence. Then, around 2000 BC, something changed. The climate shifted, becoming slightly wetter. The rivers flowed more reliably, and people began to move into the emptiness. They came from somewhere. But from where? When the first mummies were discovered in the early 20th century, the obvious answer seemed to be Europe. Their physical appearance, the tall stature, the long faces, the blonde hair, matched nothing in East Asia but resembled everything in Northern Europe. Here, it seemed, was proof that Europeans had reached China thousands of years before the Silk Road, that they had established themselves in the heart of Asia, that they had left their dead in boat-shaped coffins in the middle of a desert. This theory had political implications, and they were not lost on anyone. In the 1930s and 1940s, as nationalism swept across Europe and Asia, the discovery of white mummies in China was seized upon by those who wanted to prove the superiority of European civilization. Here was evidence, they claimed, that Europeans had been the original settlers of Asia, that they had brought civilization to the East, that the peoples of modern China were latecomers to their own land. This was nonsense, of course, but it was persuasive nonsense, and it shaped the interpretation of the mummies for decades. It was not until the 21st century, when DNA analysis became sophisticated enough to extract genetic material from ancient remains, that the true story began to emerge. In 2021, an international team of researchers published the most comprehensive genetic study of the Tarim mummies ever attempted. They analyzed the DNA of 13 individuals from the Xiaohe Cemetery, spanning the entire 1500-year period of the site's use. Their findings, published in the journal Nature, upended everything we thought we knew. The Tarim mummies were not Europeans. They were not East Asians. They were not even a mixture of the two. They were something else entirely, a population so genetically distinct that scientists had to invent a new name for them: the ancient North Eurasians. The ancient North Eurasians, or ANE, were a population that diverged from other human groups approximately 30,000 years ago, during the depths of the last ice age. They lived in the vast, cold grasslands of Siberia, hunting mammoths and woolly rhinoceroses, adapting to conditions that would have killed any other human population. When the Ice Age ended and the mammoths disappeared, most of the ANE either died out or were absorbed into other groups. Their genetic legacy survives today in tiny fractions. A few percent in modern Europeans, a few percent in Native Americans, a few percent in the peoples of northern Siberia. But in the Tarim Basin, something different happened. A small group of ANE, perhaps no more than a few hundred individuals, migrated south as the Ice Age ended, following the game or fleeing the warming climate. They found refuge in the Tarim Basin, an empty land that no other humans had yet occupied. And there, isolated by mountains and desert from the rest of humanity, they remained. For 10,000 years, this population lived in genetic isolation. They did not mix with their neighbors because they had no neighbors. They did not adopt foreign customs because there were no foreigners to adopt them from. They simply continued, generation after generation, millennium after millennium, preserving the genetic heritage of the Ice Age long after it had vanished everywhere else. When they finally began to bury their dead at Xiaohe, around 2000 BCE, they were the last surviving remnants of a population that had once dominated the northern half of Eurasia. They were living fossils, not in the sense of being primitive, but in the sense of being the last representatives of a world that had otherwise disappeared. And then, around 500 BCE, they vanished too. The mystery of the Tarim mummies is not, therefore, a mystery of migration. They did not come from Europe. Europe came from them in the sense that the ANE contributed a small fraction of their DNA to the ancestors of modern Europeans. They did not bring civilization to China. They simply lived alongside it, separate and isolated, for thousands of years. The mystery is deeper and stranger than that. The mystery is, how did they survive for so long in such complete isolation without being absorbed or destroyed by the populations that surrounded them? How did they maintain their genetic distinctiveness for 10,000 years, a span of time longer than the entire history of civilization? And why, after all that time, did they finally disappear? The answer, like the mummies themselves, lies buried in the sand. The Tarim Basin, for all its harshness, offered one thing that no other place on earth could provide: complete and total isolation. Surrounded by mountains that were impassable for most of the year, fed by rivers that flowed only during the spring melt, it was a prison as much as a refuge. The people who entered it could not easily leave. The people outside could not easily enter. For 10,000 years, the basin was a genetic island, a sealed container in which a single population could persist unchanged. But isolation cuts both ways. It protects, but it also traps. When the climate began to shift again around 1000 BCE, the rivers that sustained the Tarim oases began to dry up. The population, unable to migrate because they were surrounded by impassable barriers, could only watch as their world shrank. One by one the oases failed. One by one the settlements were abandoned. The people who had survived 10,000 years of isolation could not survive the loss of their water. By 500 BCE, the Tarim Basin was empty. The last of the ancient North Eurasians had either died or been absorbed into the small populations that remained on the basin's margins. Their culture, their language, their identity, everything that had made them distinct, vanished into the sand. But their bodies remained, preserved by the same dryness that had killed them, wrapped in woolen fabrics woven in patterns that would later become famous in Scotland, their faces painted black by processes we still do not fully understand. The Tarim mummies waited in their boat-shaped coffins for 4,000 years. They waited for us to find them. They waited for us to ask the questions they could not answer. They waited for us to tell their story. This is their story. This is the mystery of the black mummies. This is the anomaly in the desert, finally beginning to speak. There is a moment in every geneticist's career when the data stops being abstract and becomes personal. For Dr. Li Wenying, that moment came at 3:47 on a Tuesday afternoon in November 2021. She was sitting in her office at the Chinese Academy of Sciences in Beijing, staring at a computer screen filled with numbers that meant nothing to anyone who had not spent 20 years studying ancient DNA. The numbers were the results of a decade of work, the most comprehensive genetic analysis ever attempted of the Tarim mummies. She had expected confirmation. She had expected to find what every previous study had suggested, that the mummies were migrants from the West, perhaps from the steppes of Central Asia, perhaps from as far away as Europe. The physical evidence was clear: their tall stature, their long faces, their blonde hair, and the genetic evidence, she assumed, would simply provide the details. But the numbers on her screen told a different story. They told a story of isolation so complete, so profound, that it had no parallel in the archaeological record. They told a story of a population that had not mixed with anyone for 10,000 years, a span of time longer than the entire history of civilization. They told a story of ghosts. Dr. Li sat back in her chair and stared at the ceiling. She had been a scientist long enough to know that the most exciting discoveries are always the ones that contradict your expectations. But this was not merely a contradiction, it was a revolution. The Tarim mummies were not who anyone thought they were. She picked up her phone and dialed the number of her colleague in Germany, Professor Johannes Krauss, director of the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology. When he answered, she said only 4 words: Johannes, we were wrong. The story of how the Tarim mummies became genetic ghosts begins not in China, not in Germany, but in Siberia 30,000 years ago. The Earth was in the grip of the last ice age. Vast sheets of ice covered northern Europe and North America, and the sea levels were so low that land bridges connected continents that are now separated by ocean. In the cold, dry grasslands of Siberia, a region known to scientists as the Mammoth Steppe, a population of humans was adapting to conditions that would have killed any other group. These were the ancient North Eurasians or Ani. They hunted mammoths and woolly rhinoceroses with spears tipped with stone points. They wore tailored clothing sewn from animal hides. They built shelters from mammoth bones and covered them with skins. And they survived generation after generation in a world that most humans had abandoned. The Ani were not like other humans. Their bodies had adapted to the cold, shorter limbs, stockier frames, features that would later appear in the peoples of Northern Europe and Northeastern Asia. Their DNA carried markers that would eventually spread across 2 continents. But at the time, they were just another group of Ice Age hunters, struggling to survive in a world that offered no mercy. When the Ice Age ended around 12,000 years ago, the world changed. The mammoths disappeared. The grasslands turned to forests. The climate warmed and the great ice sheets retreated. The Ani, who had been perfectly adapted to the cold, found themselves in a world that no longer suited them. Most of them did not adapt. They died out or were absorbed into other populations, their genetic legacy diluted until it survived only in tiny fractions. A few percent in modern Europeans, a few percent in Native Americans, a few percent in the peoples of northern Siberia. But one group of Ani did something different. They did not stay in the north, where the warming climate was destroying their world. They did not migrate west into Europe, where other populations were already established. They did not migrate east into America, across the land bridge that still connected Siberia to Alaska. They went south, into the mountains, into the unknown, into a place that no human had ever occupied, the Tarim Basin. The Tarim Basin, when the Ani first entered it, was not the desert it is today. The Ice Age had left its mark here too, but in a different way. The glaciers that covered the surrounding mountains were melting, sending rivers of meltwater down into the basin. These rivers did not flow to the sea. They simply spread out across the basin floor, creating a patchwork of marshes, lakes, and oases. It was a land of abundance, empty of other humans waiting to be settled. The Ani who entered this land were not farmers. They were hunter-gatherers accustomed to following game across vast territories. But the Tarim Basin offered something different. The lakes and marshes teemed with fish and waterfowl. The oases supported groves of poplar and tamarisk. The surrounding mountains held game, ibex, argali sheep, perhaps even the last remnants of the Ice Age megafauna. There was no need to move. There was no need to change. The Tarim Basin provided everything a hunter-gatherer could want, and it provided it year after year, generation after generation. So the Ani stayed. They stayed for 1,000 years. They stayed for 5,000 years. They stayed for 10,000 years, a span of time longer than the entire history of civilization from Sumer to the present day. And in all that time they never left. They never mixed. They never changed. This is the story that the DNA told. When Dr. Lee and her colleagues finally published their results in the journal Nature in 2021, the scientific world was stunned. The Tarim mummies they revealed were not migrants from the West. They were not a mixture of different populations. They were the direct descendants of the ancient North Eurasians, a population that had been thought to have vanished at the end of the Ice Age. The genetic markers in their DNA matched nothing in modern populations. They matched nothing in ancient populations from surrounding regions. They matched only the Ane, a ghost population that had left no trace anywhere except in the bones of the Tarim mummies. For 10,000 years, this population had lived in complete genetic isolation. They had not intermarried with their neighbors because they had no neighbors. They had not been conquered or absorbed because no one could reach them through the mountains and deserts that surrounded their home. They had simply continued millennium after millennium, preserving the genetic heritage of the Ice Age long after it had vanished everywhere else. This is why the Tarim mummies look European but are not European. The Ane contributed a small fraction of their DNA to the ancestors of modern Europeans, perhaps 10 to 20%. This is enough to give some Europeans the tall stature and long faces that the Ane possessed. But the Tarim mummies are not the descendants of Europeans. Europeans are the partial descendants of the Ane, mixed with other populations that entered Europe after the Ice Age. The Tarim mummies are the pure version. They are the originals. They are the ghosts made flesh. But the DNA told another story as well, a story of what happened when the isolation finally ended. Around 2000 BCE, something changed in the Tarim Basin. The climate, which had been stable for millennia, began to shift. The rivers that fed the oases started to dry up. The marshes shrank. The lakes receded. The land that had supported the Ane for 10,000 years was slowly, inexorably dying. At the same time, new people began to arrive. From the west came herders from the steppes, bringing horses and bronze and a new way of life. From the east came farmers from the Yellow River Valley, bringing millet and pigs and a different set of customs. From the north came hunters from Siberia, following the game that was also retreating from the changing climate. For the first time in 10,000 years, the Tarim Basin was no longer isolated. The Ane, who had never encountered outsiders, suddenly found themselves surrounded by strangers. The DNA from later burials at Xiaohe tells a clear story. Intermarriage began. The genetic purity that had persisted for 10,000 years started to break down. The Ane genes, once dominant, began to mix with the genes of the newcomers. By 500 BCE, the process was complete. The last individuals who could claim pure Ane ancestry were gone. Their descendants survived, but they were no longer the same people. Their culture, their language, their identity, everything that had made them distinct, had been absorbed into the larger world. The Tarim mummies represent the final moment before that absorption. They are the last pure representatives of a population that had survived the end of the Ice Age, that had flourished in isolation for 10,000 years, that had watched the rise and fall of civilizations from a distance, and that was finally, at the end, being drawn into the currents of history. They are ghosts because they have no descendants. They are ghosts because their world is gone. They are ghosts because they exist only in the sand, waiting for us to find them and wonder who they were. Let us now consider what it means to be a ghost population. In genetics, a ghost population is a group that left no living descendants but contributed to the ancestry of later peoples through interbreeding. The Neanderthals are a ghost population. They interbred with modern humans and then vanished as a distinct group. The Denisovans are another ghost population. We know them only from a single finger bone and a few teeth, but their DNA lives on in the peoples of Melanesia and Australia. The Ani are a ghost population of a different kind. They did not interbreed with others and then vanish. They survived, intact and pure, for 10,000 years after their relatives had disappeared. They are ghosts because they should not exist. They are ghosts because the world they came from no longer exists. They are ghosts because they are the last echoes of a time when mammoths walked the earth and humans lived on the edge of the ice. But they are also ghosts in another sense. They are ghosts because we cannot fully know them. The DNA tells us who they were related to, but it does not tell us who they were. It tells us that they were isolated, but it does not tell us what they believed. It tells us that they survived, but it does not tell us what they thought about as they watched the stars wheel overhead in a sky unpolluted by any light but their own campfires. For that, we must turn to the graves. The Xiaohe Cemetery is not just a burial ground. It is a message from the dead to the living. The arrangement of the graves, the orientation of the bodies, the objects placed beside them, all of these carry meaning. They tell us what the A&E believed about death, about the afterlife, about the journey that every soul must make when the body finally fails. The boat-shaped coffins are the most obvious clue. Why boats in the middle of a desert? The Ani must have known that there was no water to sail on. The rivers that once flowed through the Tarim Basin had long since dried up by the time the Xiaohe Cemetery was established. Yet they continued to bury their dead in boat-shaped coffins, generation after generation, for 1,500 years. The most likely explanation is memory. The Ani remembered that their ancestors had come from somewhere else, perhaps from across a great water. They remembered that their ancestors had traveled in boats, had crossed rivers or lakes or seas, had arrived in the Tarim Basin after a journey that was both literal and symbolic. The boat-shaped coffin was a way of honoring that memory, of sending the dead on the same journey that their ancestors had made, of ensuring that they would find their way back to the place where the A&E had begun. The poles that mark the graves tell a similar story. Some are plain. Others are carved with simple designs, human faces, perhaps, or abstract symbols whose meaning has been lost. The men's graves are marked with oar-shaped poles. The women's graves with poles carved to resemble female genitalia. The message is clear. This is a society that valued gender distinctions, that marked the difference between male and female in death as in life, that believed that the journey to the afterlife required different equipment for men and for women. The bodies themselves are arranged with the same care. They lie on their backs, their arms at their sides, their heads turned slightly to one side. The men are placed on the left side of the cemetery, the women on the right. The children are buried near their mothers, as if even in death the family bond could not be broken. And then there is the blackness. The skin of the mummies is not naturally black. The Ani were fair-skinned people, adapted to the low sunlight of the Ice Age north. The blackness that covers their faces and bodies is something else. A substance applied after death, deliberately, carefully, as part of the burial ritual. What was it? The chemical analysis suggests a mixture of things. Milk, perhaps, and plant oils and pigments derived from minerals. But the exact recipe has been lost. The Ani took it with them when they vanished, leaving only the evidence of its application on the skin of their dead. Why did they do it? Why paint the dead black? The most likely explanation is symbolic. Black is the color of the earth, of the soil from which all life springs and to which all life returns. Black is the color of the night sky, through which the soul must travel to reach the afterlife. Black is the color of transformation, of the cocoon from which the butterfly emerges, of the darkness that precedes all creation. By painting their dead black, the Ani were marking them as beings in transition. They were not yet gone, but they were no longer here. They were suspended between worlds, waiting for the journey that would take them to whatever came next. This is what the graves tell us. This is the message from the dead to the living, preserved across 4,000 years, waiting for someone who could read it. The question that haunts every researcher who studies the Tarim mummies is this: did they know they were the last? Did the people who buried their dead at Xiaohe, generation after generation, millennium after millennium, understand that they were the sole survivors of a world that had otherwise vanished? Did they tell stories about the Ice Age, about the mammoths and the great grasslands, about the time when their ancestors ruled the north? Did they watch the stars and wonder if anyone else was watching them? We cannot know. The Ani left no writing, no inscriptions, no records of any kind. They left only their bodies, their graves, their black faces staring up at the sky. But perhaps that is enough. Perhaps the bodies themselves are a kind of writing, a message encoded in bone and DNA and the careful arrangement of grave goods. Perhaps the mummies are not silent at all. Perhaps they have been speaking to us all along, and we are only now learning to listen. The DNA told us who they were, the last of the ancient North Eurasians, preserved in isolation for 10,000 years. The graves told us what they believed. In journeys, in transformations, in the power of ritual to bridge the gap between life and death. The blackness told us that they saw death not as an ending but as a beginning, a passage into a different state of being, a transformation as profound as the caterpillar's metamorphosis into the butterfly. They are ghosts, yes, but ghosts can speak. Ghosts can teach. Ghosts can remind us that the world is older and stranger than we imagine, that the past is not past, that the dead are not gone. They are waiting for us in the sand. Their faces are black. Their hair is blonde. Their eyes are closed. but they are not silent. There is a word in the vocabulary of every civilization that has ever contemplated death: preservation. The Egyptians had their natron salts and linen wrappings, their canopic jars and golden masks. The Chinchorro of South America had their clay and paint, rebuilding the bodies of their dead into durable effigies. The Buddhists of Southeast Asia had their meditation and mummification, transforming monks into living statues through years of self-discipline and special diets. But none of them did what the people of Xiaohe did. None of them turned their dead black. The color of the Tarim mummies is not the brown of sun-dried leather, not the tan of natural mummification, not the gray of age and decay. It is black, deep black, uniform black. A black so complete that it seems to absorb light rather than reflect it. A black that reminds some observers of obsidian and others of the void between stars. When the first mummies were excavated in the 1930s, archaeologists assumed the blackness was simply the result of natural processes, the desert's heat and dryness acting on human skin over millennia. But as more mummies were found, and as scientific analysis became more sophisticated, that assumption began to crumble. The blackness was not natural. It was applied. The question that has haunted researchers ever since is simple to ask but maddeningly difficult to answer. Why? Why would a people go to the trouble of painting their dead black? What did the color mean to them? And what exactly was this substance that covered their skin, preserving it across 4,000 years in a state that still defies complete explanation? Let us begin with the science. When a body dies, decomposition begins immediately. Bacteria that lived peacefully in the gut during life begin to consume the body from within. Enzymes that once digested food begin to digest the cells that produced them. Within days, the body bloats. Within weeks, it liquefies. Within months, it reduces to skeleton. Mummification occurs when these processes are interrupted. In Egypt, the interruption was deliberate. The removal of internal organs, the application of dehydrating salts, the wrapping in resin-soaked linen. In the desert, the interruption is natural. Extreme dryness, extreme heat, extreme salinity can stop decomposition in its tracks, preserving skin and hair and even internal organs for thousands of years. The Tarim mummies benefited from both. The Taklamakan desert is one of the driest places on Earth. A body buried there will dehydrate rapidly, its tissues shrinking and darkening as water evaporates. The soil around Xiaohe is rich in salts, which further inhibit bacterial growth and draw moisture from the tissues. The combination is so effective that some mummies still have their eyelashes. But natural mummification produces a characteristic color: brown. The skin of naturally mummified bodies, from the Chinchorro of Chile to the bog bodies of Northern Europe, ranges from tan to dark brown, depending on the specific conditions of preservation. It does not turn black, not uniformly, not completely, not in the way that the Tarim mummies are black. The blackness of the Tarim mummies is something else entirely. In the early 2000s, a team of German and Chinese researchers was granted permission to take tiny samples of skin from several of the Xiaohe mummies. These samples, no larger than a grain of rice, were subjected to the full arsenal of modern analytical techniques: scanning electron microscopy, gas chromatography, mass spectrometry, X-ray fluorescence spectroscopy. The results were published in 2005, and they changed everything we thought we knew about the mummies. The black substance on the skin was not a single compound but a complex mixture. Its primary components were organic, proteins and fats that had clearly come from some animal source. But mixed with these were minerals: calcium, magnesium, potassium, and traces of elements that suggested the presence of plant material. The researchers identified the animal component as fermented milk products, cheese, yogurt, or something similar, that had been applied to the skin after death. The plant component appeared to come from some species of desert shrub, perhaps ephedra or tamarisk, both of which were common in the Tarim Basin and both of which had known preservative properties. But the most surprising finding was what the mixture did not contain: any pigment. The blackness was not caused by added color. There was no charcoal, no ochre, no mineral pigment of any kind in the samples. The blackness was the result of a chemical reaction, a reaction between the milk-based mixture and the skin itself, catalyzed by the extreme conditions of the desert over thousands of years. The researchers called it the melanoid reaction. The melanoid reaction is a cousin of the Maillard reaction, the same process that browns bread in the oven and meat on the grill. When proteins and sugars are heated together, they form complex polymers called melanoidins, which range in color from yellow to deep brown to black. The longer the heating, the darker the color. In the case of the Tarim mummies, the milk-based mixture provided the proteins and sugars. The desert provided the heat, not the intense heat of an oven, but the steady, persistent warmth of a climate where summer temperatures regularly exceed 40 degrees Celsius. Over centuries, this gentle heat cooked the mixture on the skin, slowly transforming it into the deep, uniform black that we see today. But the melanoid reaction alone cannot explain everything. For one thing, the blackness is too uniform, too complete, too perfectly applied. If the mixture had simply been poured over the bodies, it would have pooled in some areas and missed others. If it had been applied haphazardly, it would have left streaks and patches. Instead, the blackness covers every exposed surface evenly, as if the bodies had been dipped in a vat of liquid darkness. This suggests deliberate, careful application. It suggests ritual. It suggests that the people of Xiaohe knew exactly what they were doing when they covered their dead in milk and plant extracts and laid them in the sand. But why? What purpose did this blackening serve? The most obvious explanation is preservation. The people of Xiaohe may have observed that milk-based mixtures, when applied to organic materials, helped them last longer in the harsh desert environment. They may have experimented with different recipes over generations, refining their technique until they achieved the perfect balance of ingredients. The blackening of the skin may have been a side effect, an unintended consequence of a process designed solely to preserve the bodies of their dead. But there are problems with this explanation. First, the milk-based mixture was not necessary for preservation. The desert would have mummified the bodies naturally, as it had mummified countless other organisms over millions of years. The addition of milk and plant extracts may have actually slowed the natural drying process, trapping moisture in the tissues rather than allowing it to escape. Second, the mixture was applied only to certain parts of the body. The faces were always blackened, as were the hands and feet. But other areas, the chest, the back, the limbs, were often left untreated. If the goal was preservation, why not treat the entire body? Why focus on the parts that would be most visible to the living? Third, the mixture was not applied to everyone equally. Men and women received slightly different treatments. Children were sometimes blackened, sometimes not. The variation suggests that the blackening was not a one-size-fits-all procedure but a ritual tailored to each individual, perhaps reflecting their status, their age, or their role in the community. The most compelling explanation, therefore, is not practical but symbolic. The people of Xiaohe painted their dead black because black meant something to them. Black was the color of transformation, of transition, of the journey from life to death and from death to whatever came next. By covering their dead in darkness, they were marking them as beings in between, no longer fully of this world but not yet arrived at the next. This interpretation is supported by other elements of the burial ritual. The boat-shaped coffins, as we have seen, suggest a journey. The orientation of the bodies, with their heads pointing west, suggests a destination, perhaps the land of the dead, perhaps the place where the ancestors came from. The grave goods, food, clothing, tools, suggest that the dead would need these things on their journey, that they were not simply ending but continuing. The blackness in this context is the color of the night through which they must travel. It is the color of the soil from which they came and to which they will return. It is the color of the unknown, of the mystery that awaits every human being at the end of life. By painting their dead black, the people of Xiaohe were not just preserving bodies, they were preparing souls. They were equipping the departed for the long journey ahead, providing them with the darkness they would need to navigate the space between worlds. Let us now consider the hands. Among the most striking features of the Tarim mummies are their hands. In many cases, the fingers are perfectly preserved, the nails still attached, the skin still flexible after 4,000 years. And on many of these hands, the fingernails are painted, not black, red. The red pigment on the fingernails of the Xiaohe mummies has been analyzed and identified as hematite, iron oxide, the same mineral that prehistoric peoples around the world used to create red ochre. Red ochre has been associated with burial rituals for at least 100,000 years. It appears in graves from Africa to Europe to Australia, always with the same implication. Red is the color of life, of blood, of the vitality that departs at death and must somehow be restored or honored. The people of Xiaohe then used two colors in their burial rituals: red for the fingernails, black for the skin. Red for life, for the blood that once flowed through these bodies. Black for death, for the journey that lies ahead. Together, they form a complete statement about the nature of human existence. We are born in blood, we die in darkness, and between these two poles lies everything that matters. But the hands reveal something else as well. In several mummies, the hands are positioned in a specific way, crossed over the chest, the right hand over the left, the fingers slightly curled as if holding something that is no longer there. This position is not random, it is deliberate. It is the same position found in countless other burials across Eurasia, from the steppes of Siberia to the plains of Europe. What were they holding? The answer may lie in the graves themselves. Beside many of the mummies, archaeologists found small bundles wrapped in cloth. When these bundles were opened, they contained grains of wheat and millet, fragments of cheese, pieces of dried meat, food for the journey, provisions for the dead. The hands, curled as if holding something, may have once held these bundles. Or they may have held something else. Something that has not survived the centuries, something that the living placed in the hands of the dead as a final gift, a last token of love. We cannot know. The hands hold only air now. But their position speaks across the millennia, telling us that the people of Xiaohe believed in a journey, in a destination, in a continuation of existence beyond the grave. Now consider the faces. The blackness on the faces of the mummies is particularly striking because the faces are the most expressive part of any human body. Even in death, even after 4,000 years, the faces of the Xiaohe mummies retain a haunting individuality. Some are serene, almost smiling as if death came as a friend. Others are twisted, their features frozen in expressions of pain or fear. One woman, known to archaeologists as the beauty of Xiaohe, is so perfectly preserved that she looks as if she might open her eyes at any moment. The blackness obscures these expressions, but it does not erase them. If anything, it enhances them, giving them a dramatic intensity that they would not otherwise possess. The black face of the beauty of Xiaohe, with her high cheekbones and delicate features, is one of the most haunting images in all of archaeology, a reminder that death is not the end of beauty, merely its transformation. But the blackness also serves another purpose. It unifies. Beneath the black pigment, the faces of the Xiaohe mummies are as individual as any group of human faces. Above the pigment, they become a collective, a community of the dead bound together by a shared ritual. The blackness says, "We are all the same in death, no matter how different we were in life." The blackness says, individuality ends here at the threshold of the journey. The blackness says, now you are one of us, one of the ancestors, one of the shadows that watch over the living. This may be the deepest meaning of the ritual. By painting their dead black, the people of Xiaohe were not just preparing individuals for the afterlife. They were creating a community of the dead, a collective of ancestors who would remain present in the lives of their descendants. The blackness was a uniform, a badge of membership in the company of those who had gone before. The question that remains, the question that may never be fully answered, is whether the people of Xiaohe understood the chemistry of what they were doing. Did they know that the milk-based mixture, combined with the heat of the desert over centuries, would turn their dead black? Or did they simply apply the mixture for other reasons? Preservation, perhaps, or ritual purity, and discover the blackening only later, when they opened the graves of their ancestors and found their faces transformed. The evidence suggests the former. The uniformity of the application, the consistency of the recipe across centuries, the careful targeting of certain body parts, all of these indicate a deliberate process, refined over generations, passed down as sacred knowledge from elders to initiates. The people of Xiaohe knew what they were doing. They intended the blackness. They valued it. But why they valued it, what the blackness meant to them, remains a mystery. We can guess, based on the other elements of their burial ritual, that it was connected to their beliefs about death and the afterlife. We can speculate that it represented transformation, transition, the passage from one state of being to another. We can imagine that it was a gift, a final act of love performed by the living for the dead. But we cannot know. The people of Xiaohe left no texts, no inscriptions, no written records of any kind. They left only their bodies, their graves, their black faces staring up at the sky. And those faces, for all their silence, are eloquent. They tell us that the people of Xiaohe cared deeply about their dead. They tell us that they believed in something beyond this life. They tell us that they were willing to invest enormous time and resources in preparing their loved ones for whatever came next. They tell us that 4,000 years ago, in one of the most remote and inhospitable places on Earth, a group of humans looked at death and refused to accept it as the end. They looked at the faces of their loved ones and saw not emptiness but possibility. They looked at the darkness and saw not oblivion but transformation. They painted their dead black, and in doing so they painted themselves into history. When the first Tarim mummies were discovered, the world focused on their faces. The blonde hair, the long features, the black skin. But as excavations continued and more graves were opened, archaeologists realized that the bodies themselves were only part of the story. The mummies were dressed, and their clothing was unlike anything anyone had ever seen in ancient China. The woolen fabrics that wrapped the dead of Xiaohe were woven in patterns that would later become famous thousands of kilometers to the west. Checks, stripes, and tartans. The same patterns that today identify Scottish clans, that symbolize Highland heritage, that adorn kilts and scarves sold in Edinburgh gift shops. These same patterns were being worn by the people of the Tarim Basin 4,000 years ago. The discovery sent shockwaves through the archaeological community. How could people in the heart of Asia be wearing textiles that looked like they came from the British Isles? Was there contact between these distant regions at a time when most of Europe was still in the Neolithic? Or had the patterns been invented independently, a case of convergent evolution in textile design? The answers, when they came, were more surprising than anyone had imagined. Let us begin with the wool itself. The sheep that provided the wool for the Xiaohe textiles were not the wild sheep of Central Asia. They were domesticated sheep, their wool carefully bred over generations to produce the long, fine fibers needed for spinning. The people of Xiaohe were herders, not hunters. They depended on their flocks for food, for clothing, for the milk that would become cheese and the skin that would become leather. The wool was processed with remarkable skill. It was cleaned, carded, spun into yarn of uniform thickness. a task that requires patience and practice, and that produces thread of consistent quality only when done by experienced hands. The yarn was then dyed using natural pigments derived from plants and minerals. The colors that survive today, red, brown, blue, yellow, were once bright and vivid, the result of sophisticated dyeing techniques that would not be matched in Europe for another 2,000 years. And then came the weaving. The looms used by the people of Xiaohe were simple horizontal ground looms, the kind that have been used by pastoral peoples across Eurasia for millennia. But the patterns they wove were not simple. The checks and stripes required careful planning, the counting of threads, the coordination of multiple colors across the width of the fabric. A mistake of a single thread would ruin the pattern, yet the surviving textiles show no mistakes. They are perfect as anything produced by the best weavers of any era. The most famous of these textiles is the tartan of Xiaohe, a piece of woolen cloth recovered from the grave of a man who died around 1000 BCE. Its pattern is unmistakable, a grid of intersecting stripes in red, brown, and natural white, forming the characteristic checked pattern that the world associates with Scotland. When photographs of this textile were first published, Scottish newspapers ran stories with headlines like, "Ancient tartan found in China? Proof that Scots ruled the world?" But the people of Xiaohe were not Scots. They were not even European. They were the last of the ancient North Eurasians, a population that had been isolated in the Tarim Basin for 10,000 years. The tartan pattern was not imported from anywhere. It was invented locally, developed over centuries by a people who had never seen a Scottish kilt and never would. The question is, why? Why did the people of Xiaohe choose to weave their wool in checks and stripes? What did these patterns mean to them? And how did they develop such sophisticated textile technology in such an isolated location? The answer, as with so many questions about Xiaohe, lies in the practical realities of pastoral life. The people of Xiaohe were nomads, or at least semi-nomads. They moved with their flocks between seasonal pastures, following the grass and water that sustained their sheep. In such a mobile lifestyle, possessions had to be portable, durable, multi-purpose. A piece of woolen cloth could serve as clothing, as bedding, as shelter, as trade goods. It had to be strong enough to withstand years of use, yet flexible enough to serve many different functions. The checked patterns were not merely decorative, they were structural. The intersecting stripes created a fabric that was stronger than plain weave, more resistant to tearing and wear. The colors, derived from local plants and minerals, helped to identify the owner. Each family or clan may have had its own distinctive pattern, a textile signature that marked their possessions as surely as a brand marks cattle. But the patterns may also have had deeper meaning. Among many pastoral peoples, textiles are not just practical objects. They are carriers of identity, memory, and tradition. The patterns woven into a woman's dress or a man's cloak tell stories. Where they come from, who their ancestors were, what spirits protect them. The patterns are a form of writing, a code that can be read by those who know the language. We do not know the language of the Xiaohe patterns. No one has cracked the code. but the patterns themselves survive, woven into wool that has lasted 4,000 years, waiting for someone who can read them. Now let us turn from clothing to food. In the graves of Xiaohe, alongside the bodies and the textiles, archaeologists found small bundles wrapped in cloth. When these bundles were opened, they contained something unexpected: cheese. Not the hard, aged cheese of European tradition, but something softer, fresher. A crumbly white substance that had been placed beside the dead as food for the journey. When analyzed, this cheese proved to be the oldest known cheese in the world, predating the earliest European cheeses by more than 1,000 years. The cheese was made from the milk of sheep and goats, the same animals that provided wool for the textiles and meat for the living. The process of cheese making was simple but sophisticated. The milk was fermented with bacterial cultures, then strained and pressed to remove the whey. The resulting cheese was rich in protein and fat, easy to transport, and capable of being stored for long periods without spoiling. For a nomadic people, cheese was the perfect food. It concentrated the nutritional value of milk into a portable, durable form. It could be eaten fresh or aged, alone or mixed with other foods. It provided sustenance on long journeys when fresh milk might not be available. It was, in short, a technological innovation as important as the wheel or the plow. But the cheese of Xiaohe was more than just food. Like the textiles, it was a carrier of meaning. The bacterial cultures used to ferment the milk were passed down from generation to generation, each family maintaining its own strain, its own recipe, its own tradition. The cheese that accompanied the dead on their final journey was not just any cheese. It was their cheese, made by their family, imbued with their identity. The presence of cheese in the graves tells us something profound about the people of Xiaohe. They believed that the journey to the afterlife would be long, and that the dead would need sustenance along the way. They equipped their loved ones not just with symbolic goods but with real food, practical provisions for a journey that they understood to be real and demanding. They also tell us that the people of Xiaohe valued their animals not just for meat but for milk, a distinction that may seem minor but has enormous implications. Milking requires a different relationship with animals than hunting or even herding for meat. It requires patience, gentleness, and a willingness to invest in the long-term productivity of the flock rather than its immediate consumption. It implies a level of domestication that goes beyond simple control, a partnership almost between humans and animals. The people of Xiaohe had such a partnership. They lived with their sheep and goats, depended on them for food and clothing, honored them by including their milk in the graves of the dead. The animals were not just resources. They were companions on the long journey of life, and their presence continued even in death. Let us now consider the most mysterious of all the Xiaohe artifacts, the wooden totems. The cemetery at Xiaohe is marked by hundreds of wooden poles, arranged in concentric circles around the graves. Some of these poles are plain, their surfaces weathered smooth by centuries of wind and sand. Others are carved, with human faces, with abstract symbols, with patterns that may represent animals or spirits or something else entirely. The carved poles are particularly striking. They depict faces with long noses, deep-set eyes, and open mouths, faces that bear a striking resemblance to the mummies themselves. Were these portraits of the dead representations of their spirits, guardians placed to protect the graves from harm? The answer is not clear, but the faces stare out from the wood with an intensity that is hard to ignore. The poles are arranged in a specific pattern. The tallest ones, some reaching 5 meters in height, stand at the center of the cemetery, marking the graves of important individuals, chiefs, perhaps, or shamans, or the founders of lineages. Around them, smaller poles mark the graves of ordinary people. The entire arrangement suggests a society with hierarchy, with distinctions of rank and status that were maintained even in death. But the poles also suggest something else, a connection to the sky. The tallest poles point upward toward the heavens as if they were intended to guide the souls of the dead on their upward journey. The boat-shaped coffins, as we have seen, suggest a journey across water. Together, the coffins and the poles suggest a cosmology in which the dead traveled both across and upward, through water and air, to reach their final destination. This is sophisticated thinking. This is theology encoded in wood and burial practice. The people of Xiaohe had a complex understanding of the afterlife, a set of beliefs that they expressed through the material culture they left behind. Now consider the copper and bronze artifacts found in some of the graves. Metal was rare at Xiaohe. Most of the tools and weapons found in the cemetery are made of stone, bone, or wood. But a few graves contain small copper or bronze objects, knives, awls, ornaments, that must have been incredibly valuable to their owners. The source of this metal is a mystery. There are no copper deposits in the Tarim Basin, and the nearest sources are hundreds of kilometers away, in the mountains that surround the desert. The people of Xiaohe must have traded for their metal, exchanging wool, cheese, or other goods with the mining peoples of the highlands. This trade, if it existed, would have been the first thread in a web of exchange that would eventually become the Silk Road. The people of Xiaohe were not just isolated survivors of the Ice Age. They were participants in a network that connected the highlands and the lowlands, the mountains and the desert, the east and the west. They were not outside history. They were part of it, even if their part has been largely forgotten. The presence of metal in some graves also suggests social differentiation. Not everyone could afford copper or bronze. Only the wealthy, the powerful, the important had such valuable goods placed in their graves. The people of Xiaohe were not egalitarian. They had chiefs, elites, individuals whose status was marked by the possessions that accompanied them into death. But what did these elites do? How did they justify their status? The graves offer clues but no clear answers. Perhaps they were warriors, leaders in the conflicts that occasionally arose between competing groups. Perhaps they were shamans, intermediaries between the living and the dead, the human and the spirit worlds. Perhaps they were simply the heads of large and successful families, their status derived from the number of their descendants and the size of their flocks. We cannot know. The dead do not tell us their titles, their achievements, their reasons for being important. They only show us that they were important and leave us to wonder why. The most famous of all the Xiaohe burials is that of the Beauty of Xiaohe, a woman who died around 1500 BCE at the age of approximately 40. Her body is remarkably preserved. Her skin, blackened by the burial process, still covers her bones. Her hair, long and brown, cascades over her shoulders. Her eyelashes, impossibly, are still intact. She lies on her back, her arms at her sides, her face turned slightly to the west. She is dressed in a woolen gown of remarkable sophistication, a long tunic woven in a pattern of red and natural stripes, belted at the waist with a cord of twisted wool. On her head she wears a felt hat, tall and pointed, decorated with a band of red wool. On her feet are leather boots, carefully stitched, their soles worn from use. Beside her body, archaeologists found a basket containing grains of wheat and millet, fragments of cheese, and a small bundle of ephedra twigs, the same plant that may have been used in the blackening mixture applied to her skin. The ephedra suggests that she may have been a healer, a shaman, someone who worked with medicinal plants in life and needed them for her journey in death. The Beauty of Xiaohe is not just a mummy, she is a person. She was someone's daughter, someone's wife, someone's mother. She was loved, honored, prepared for death with care and reverence. 4,000 years later, she still has the power to move us, to make us wonder about her life, her loves, her hopes, her fears. She is the face of Xiaohe. She is the symbol of a people who lived and died in one of the most remote places on earth, who left no writing but left themselves, preserved in the sand, waiting for us to find them. The technology of Xiaohe, the wool, the cheese, the metal, the wood, tells us that these people were not primitive survivors of an earlier age. They were sophisticated, skilled, creative. They adapted to their environment with ingenuity and persistence. They built a culture that sustained them for thousands of years, that honored their dead and prepared them for the journey, that left behind artifacts that still astonish us with their beauty and craftsmanship. They were not outside history. They were part of it, even if their part has been largely forgotten. They were connected to the wider world through trade and exchange, even if those connections were tenuous and intermittent. They were human, fully human, with all the complexity and creativity that humanity implies. The tartan patterns and the world's oldest cheese are not just curiosities, they are evidence. They are proof that the people of Xiaohe were not just survivors but creators, not just passive recipients of their environment but active shapers of their world. They took the wool of their sheep and turned it into cloth that still looks modern after 4,000 years. They took the milk of their goats and turned it into cheese that still contains the bacterial cultures that made it. They took the wood of their poplar trees and turned it into boats for the dead to sail across the sands of eternity. They were makers. They were doers. They were human. And they are gone. There is a moment in the history of every civilization when the trajectory shifts from growth to decline. Sometimes the shift is sudden, a war, a plague, a natural disaster that destroys in days what took centuries to build. Sometimes it is gradual, a slow unraveling, a quiet fading, a process so gentle that those living through it may not even notice that their world is ending. For the people of Xiaohe, the shift was gradual, and it was caused by water. The Tarim Basin, for all its aridity, was not always a desert. When the first ancient North Eurasians arrived 10,000 years ago, the basin was a patchwork of lakes and marshes, fed by glaciers melting in the surrounding mountains. The rivers that flowed down from those mountains, the Tarim, the Korea, the Naya, carried enough water to sustain oases across the desert floor. The people of Xiaohe settled along one of these rivers, a watercourse that has long since disappeared. They called it the Little River in their language, a name that survived only in the memory of local Uyghur hunters, who passed it down through generations until it reached the ears of Sven Hedin's expedition in 1934. The Little River was their lifeline. It provided water for their flocks, irrigation for their fields, fish for their tables, reeds for their baskets. It was the reason they could survive in a place where no one else could live. It was their mother, their provider, their reason for being. And then, slowly, inexorably, it began to die. The death of the Little River was not a single event but a process spanning centuries. It began with a shift in climate, a gradual warming that caused the glaciers in the surrounding mountains to retreat. As the glaciers shrank, the meltwater that fed the rivers diminished. The flow became weaker, more erratic, less reliable. At first, the people of Xiaohe adapted. They dug canals to distribute the water more efficiently. They shifted their crops to varieties that required less irrigation. They moved their settlements closer to the remaining water sources. They did what humans have always done when faced with environmental change. They tried to adjust. But the water continued to diminish. The lakes shrank, leaving rings of salt on the exposed shores. The marshes dried, their reeds turning to dust. The fish died, their bones bleaching in the sun. The river itself, once a permanent stream, became seasonal, flowing only during the spring melt, reduced to a trickle for the rest of the year. The people of Xiaohe faced a choice: stay and die, or leave and lose everything that made them who they were. Some left. The archaeological record shows a gradual decline in the number of burials at Xiaohe after 1000 BCE. Families, then entire clans, packed their belongings and moved to other oases, to the mountains, to places where water still flowed. They took their sheep, their looms, their knowledge of cheese making and textile production. They took their stories, their songs, their memories of a homeland that was disappearing. Others stayed. The last burials at Xiaohe date to around 500 BCE, 1500 years after the first graves were dug. These final burials are poorer than the earlier ones, the grave goods fewer, the bodies less carefully prepared. The people who remained were the ones who could not leave, the old, the sick, the stubborn, the faithful. They clung to their ancestral cemetery even as the water that sustained them disappeared. And then one day the last burial was made. The last body was placed in its boat-shaped coffin, its face painted black, its hands crossed over its chest. The last prayers were spoken. The last offerings were placed in the sand. And then there was no one left to bury. What happened to the people who left? This is one of the great unanswered questions of Tarim archaeology. The descendants of the Xiaohe people did not simply vanish. They must have gone somewhere, must have merged with other populations, must have carried their genes and their culture into new lands. The DNA evidence provides some clues. After 500 BCE, the genetic signature of the ancient North Eurasians begins to appear in other populations across Central Asia. A few percent here, a few percent there, the ghost population becoming ghosts in truth, their genetic legacy diluted but not destroyed by intermarriage with the peoples who surrounded them. The people of Xiaohe did not die out. They were absorbed. Their descendants live on in the populations of modern Central Asia, in the Uyghurs of Xinjiang, in the Kazakhs of the steppes, in the Mongols of the Eastern Plateau. A small fraction of their DNA, a few genetic markers passed down through thousands of generations, is all that remains of a population that once ruled the Tarim Basin. But their culture, their language, their beliefs, their rituals, did not survive. The boat-shaped coffins, the black-painted faces, the tartan textiles, all of these disappeared with the last generation that remembered what they meant. The people who absorbed the Xiaohe descendants did not adopt their ways. They had their own ways, their own traditions, their own beliefs about death and the afterlife. The culture of Xiaohe died with the last person who understood its meaning. And that person died 4,000 kilometers and 2,000 years away from anything we could call history. Now consider what was lost. The people of Xiaohe had a language, a tongue that had evolved in isolation for 10,000 years, shaped by the unique conditions of their desert home. That language is gone. No one remembers a single word of it. The sounds that parents spoke to children, that lovers whispered in the dark, that shamans chanted over the dying, all of it has vanished into the silence. They had stories, epic tales of the Ice Age, of mammoth hunts and great migrations, of ancestors who crossed mountains and deserts to reach this promised land. Those stories are gone. No one remembers the heroes, the villains, the triumphs, the tragedies that shaped their understanding of the world. They had songs, melodies composed over thousands of years, passed down from mother to daughter, from father to son. Those songs are gone. No one can hum a tune that was heard in the Tarim Basin 4,000 years ago. They had beliefs, a complex theology of death and rebirth, of journeys across water and through darkness, of ancestors who watched over the living from the spirit world. Those beliefs are gone. No one remembers the names of their gods, the structure of their cosmology, the rituals that gave meaning to their lives. All that remains are the bodies. Black-faced, blonde-haired, wrapped in tartan wool, lying in boat-shaped coffins in the sand. They are the last witnesses to a world that no longer exists. They are the only voices that can still speak, and they speak only through the evidence of their bones. The silence of Xiaohe is not empty. It is filled with absence, with the ghost of language, the echo of songs, the shadow of beliefs that no one remembers. It is the silence of a civilization that ended not with a bang but with a whisper, not with destruction but with dissolution, not with conquest but with the slow, inexorable drying of a river. This is the fate that awaits all civilizations, Eventually, the rivers dry, the climate shifts, the resources run out. The people adapt, migrate, or die. The monuments crumble. The language dies. The songs fade. And all that remains are the bodies, waiting in the sand for someone to find them and wonder who they were. The people of Xiaohe are not unique. They are simply one example of a process that has repeated itself countless times across human history. They are a reminder that civilizations are fragile, that cultures are temporary, that everything we build will eventually be buried by sand. But they are also a reminder of something else, that the dead do not disappear completely. They leave traces, bones, artifacts, DNA that can speak across millennia. They leave questions that we are still trying to answer. They leave a mystery that will never be fully solved, and that is precisely why we keep returning to it. The mystery is the point. The not knowing is what keeps us searching. The silence is what makes us listen. Let us now step back from Xiaohe and consider what the Tarim mummies mean for us, for our understanding of history, for our sense of our own place in the world, for our relationship with the past. The first lesson is humility. Before the discovery of the Tarim mummies, historians and archaeologists thought they understood the peopling of Asia. They had a neat narrative. East Asians came from the east, Europeans from the west, and the two populations met somewhere in the middle and mixed. The Tarim mummies shattered that narrative. They revealed a third population, a ghost population, that had persisted in isolation for 10,000 years, surviving the end of the Ice Age and the rise of civilizations, only to vanish at the dawn of recorded history. If we could be so wrong about something so fundamental, what else are we wrong about? How many other ghost populations are waiting to be discovered? How many other civilizations lie buried beneath the sand, waiting for someone to ask the right questions? The answer is we don't know, and we will never know completely. The past is not a puzzle to be solved, but an abyss to be contemplated. We can peer into it, we can glimpse fragments of what lies there, but we can never fully illuminate it. The darkness will always remain. The second lesson is connection. The people of Xiaohe were isolated, geographically, genetically, culturally, for 10,000 years. But they were not completely cut off from the world. The metal in their graves came from distant mountains. The patterns in their textiles would later appear in Scotland. The cheese beside their bodies was made with techniques that spread across Eurasia over millennia. They were part of a web of trade, of migration, of cultural exchange, that connected the highlands and the lowlands, the east and the west, the past and the present. That web would eventually become the Silk Road, the greatest network of exchange in pre-modern history. The people of Xiaohe were not outside that network. They were its pioneers, its first participants, its forgotten founders. We are connected to them, however tenuously. A fraction of their DNA flows in the veins of modern Central Asians. A trace of their textile patterns survives in the tartans of Scotland, not through direct transmission, but through the mysterious ways that human creativity sometimes converges on similar solutions. A memory of their cheese-making techniques persists in every dairy that ferments milk into curds. They are not as distant as they seem. They are not as different as they appear. They are us, 4,000 years ago, living in a world we can barely imagine but still somehow recognize. The third lesson is mortality. The people of Xiaohe died because their river died. They adapted, they adjusted, they tried to survive, and in the end they failed. The climate changed and they could not change with it fast enough. The water disappeared and they disappeared with it. This is not a story from the distant past. This is a story that is playing out right now all over the world. As the climate warms and the glaciers retreat and the rivers dry, millions of people face the same choice that the people of Xiaohe faced. Stay and die, or leave and lose everything that makes them who they are. The people of Xiaohe had somewhere to go. They had mountains to flee to, neighbors to absorb them, a wider world that could accommodate their refugees. Not everyone today has that luxury. When the rivers dry in sub-Saharan Africa, when the seas rise in Bangladesh, when the storms intensify in the Caribbean, where do the people go? Who absorbs them? What happens to their culture, their language, their identity? The answer all too often is nothing. They become ghosts. They become statistics. They become footnotes in reports about climate migration. They become the people who used to live where no one can live anymore. The people of Xiaohe are not just ancient history. They are a warning. They are a mirror. They are us in a future that is closer than we think. Let us return one final time to the cemetery at Xiaohe. The sun is setting over the Taklamakan desert. The wind, which has blown all day, is finally dying down. The sand, which has been shifting for millennia, is briefly still. In this moment of stillness, the graves of Xiaohe are visible, not as individual features, but as a dark smudge against the pale desert floor, the only break in the infinite monotony of sand. Beneath that sand, 300 people lie in their boat-shaped coffins. Their faces are black, their hair is blonde, their hands are crossed over their chests. Beside them are the tools they used in life, the food they would need for the journey, the symbols of a culture that no longer exists. They have been waiting here for 4,000 years. They will wait here for 4,000 more. The desert does not forget. The sand does not judge. The silence does not break. But we have broken it. We have disturbed their rest, examined their bodies, analyzed their DNA, published their secrets in journals that will themselves one day turn to dust. We have taken their silence and turned it into story. Was this a violation? Perhaps. The dead have a right to their privacy, their rest, their silence. But the dead also have a story to tell, a story that can teach us about ourselves, about our past, about our future. The people of Xiaohe, if they could speak, might forgive us our curiosity. They might understand that we are also searching, also wondering, also trying to make sense of a world that often seems senseless. They might even welcome our attention. After 4,000 years of silence, even the dead might appreciate being remembered. The beauty of Xiaohe lies in her grave, her face turned toward the west. The setting sun, if it could reach her, would illuminate her black skin, her brown hair, her closed eyes. But the sun does not reach her. She lies in darkness, in silence, in the deep peace of the desert that has preserved her for so long. She is beautiful still, not in the way of the living, with movement, with expression, with the subtle play of emotion across features, but in the way of the dead, still, serene, complete. She has finished her journey. She has arrived at her destination. She is where she was meant to be. We, the living, are still traveling. We are still searching, still wondering, still trying to understand. We look at her and see a mystery. We look at her and see ourselves. We look at her and see what we will one day become. The people of Xiaohe are gone. Their river is dry. Their language is forgotten. Their songs are silence. But they are not nothing. They are the black-faced witnesses to a world that was, a world that could have been, a world that might have lasted if only the water had continued to flow. The water did not continue. The world ended. But they remain waiting in the sand, teaching us what it means to be human in a universe that does not care whether we survive or not. They teach us that survival is not enough. Flourishing matters. Culture matters. Memory matters. The things we make, the stories we tell, the songs we sing, these are what make us human, and these are what survive when the rivers dry and the civilizations fall. The people of Xiaohe made things. They told stories. They sang songs. And now, 4,000 years later, we are still listening. And so our story ends. 4,000 years ago, on the banks of a river that no longer exists, a people lived and died in the heart of the Taklamakan desert. They were the last witnesses of the Ice Age. They came from a time the world had forgotten, and they lived in a time the world would forget. Their hair was blonde. Their stature was tall. They painted their dead black and laid them in boat-shaped coffins facing west, toward the setting sun, toward the place where their ancestors had come from, toward a journey that would last 4,000 years. They had a language, a tongue that no living soul remembers. They had songs, melodies that no human voice will ever sing again. They had beliefs, gods whose names have dissolved into silence, rituals whose meanings have crumbled into dust. And then the river dried. One day the last child was born. One day the last woman died. One day the last man was laid in the sand, and after him, there was no one left to remember. But the desert remembered. The same dryness that killed their rivers preserved their bodies. The same isolation that kept them pure kept them safe. For 4,000 years they waited, black-faced, blonde-haired, wrapped in tartan wool, beneath the sands of the Taklamakan. They waited for someone to find them. They waited for someone to ask who they were. They waited for someone to tell their story. And now you have heard it. Tonight you traveled across time. You stood at the edge of the Xiaohe Cemetery and watched as archaeologists opened a coffin that had been sealed for 4 millennia. You looked into the face of a woman who died when the pyramids were still new, when Stonehenge was still under construction, when the Bronze Age was just beginning. Her skin was black. Her eyelashes were intact. She was beautiful. You followed the DNA trail back through 10,000 years of isolation, discovering a ghost population that survived the end of the Ice Age only to vanish when their rivers dried. You learned that they were not Europeans who wandered east, not Asians who wandered west, They were something else entirely, the last pure remnants of a world that no longer exists. You uncovered the secret of their black skin. Not paint, not pigment, but a chemical reaction between fermented milk and desert heat. A ritual of preservation that turned their dead into obsidian monuments to love. You marveled at their technology. Tartan cloth woven 4,000 years before Scotland existed. Cheese that still carries the bacterial cultures of the Bronze Age. Wooden totems carved with faces that still stare across the millennia. And you watched as their world ended, not with a bang, not with conquest, not with catastrophe, but with the slow, inexorable drying of a river. The water stopped flowing. The people scattered. The culture dissolved. And all that remained were the bodies waiting in the sand. This is not just their story. This is our story. Because we too depend on rivers. We too build civilizations on the assumption that tomorrow will be like today. We too believe that our culture, our language, our way of life will last forever. The people of Xiaohe believed that too. And they were wrong. The climate changed. The water stopped. Their world ended. And 4,000 years later, all that remains are questions. Questions that we are only beginning to answer, questions that may never be fully answered, questions that keep us searching, wondering, learning. That is why this channel exists. Scientific Serenity is not just about sleep stories. It is about connection, connection to the past, connection to the universe, connection to the mystery of existence itself. We tell these stories because the dead cannot tell them themselves. We remember because forgetting would be a second death. We wonder because wonder is what makes us human. If this journey has moved you, if the black faces of Xiaohe have touched something deep in your consciousness, then I invite you to be part of this mission. Subscribe to Scientific Serenity, not because you need another YouTube channel in your feed, not because you're afraid of missing out. Subscribe because you believe that the past matters. Subscribe because you believe that stories matter. Subscribe because you believe that 4,000 years from now, when some future civilization digs through the ruins of our world, they will find our stories, and they will know that we too once lived and loved and wondered. The people of Xiaohe are gone. Their river is dry. Their language is silence. But they are not forgotten. Not anymore. Not while you are here. Not while this channel exists. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep, carry them with you. The tall men with blonde hair. The women with black faces and painted fingurna.